3 years ago, I explained how Backstabs worked on a technical level in every Souls game leading up to Elden Ring, and how they seemed to be in a virtually unusable state in the network test. As feared, they were indeed that bad in the full release. But after several changes scattered across 2 years worth of patches, they evolved into this. So, what even happened there? How is he performing these? Well, I could throw up all the raw changes on screen for you to see, but that really wouldn't help you understand why all your backstabs still look like this. Instead, we're going to start by going back to basics. Said basics have stayed consistent since the network test, so they'll be applicable regardless of the changes that we'll talk about later. So, without further ado, backstabs work in 3 stages: attempt initiation, hit detection, and defender confirmation. Pressing the input for a light attack under certain conditions will initiate a backstab attempt, specifically when the relative positions and orientations between you and an opposing player are within certain bounds. As I explained in the original video, this used to be the only step in Dark Souls 1 and Demon Souls. Once it was satisfied, it would instantly lock both players in a synchronous backstab animation. Dark Souls 2 added a second stage, where instead of transitioning straight into the backstab, it initiates a fast attack which would take the opposing player into the backstab only if it hit. The hitbox of this attack can be referred to as a grab box. Dark Souls 3 added a final step, in which the target of a backstab would remotely run a distance check after their attacker hits them with the previously mentioned grab box. Elden Ring added some additional checks to this step which are very similar to the checks performed for an initiation, in that they check if the poses of the players relative to each other are within certain bounds. If these checks succeed, the target of a backstab pulls themselves and their backstabber into the synchronous animation. It's important to note that this last step is the only one that runs on the opposing game, so the more latency you have with a player, the longer it will take for this check to run after the first 2. Did you get all that? Probably not. And the fancy visuals I put on screen probably just confuse you further. Well, if we want to understand how we can do this, and how a series of patches enabled this to happen, you're gonna have to let me do my best to go into some detail. So again, the 3 stages: attempt initiation, hit detection, and defender confirmation. Let's start with attempt initiation. It's again where the game decides whether or not to turn your input for a light attack into a backstab attempt. I think the best way to explain how they do this is to make it ourselves. Here's what I mean. If you were to try and come up with some rules to decide when to turn a light attack input into a backstab input, how would we start? Forget the later stages. Let's just assume this is the only step, like Dark Souls 1 or Demon Souls, where it was originally introduced.
What? Excuse me?
Your first thought may be to compare the facing angles of the players. You check if the absolute difference between the angles is less than a set amount, say 35 degrees. And if it is, turn it into a backstab. I'm going to refer to this as the angle check. By angle, we are referring to a measurement of how rotated the player is around their Y or vertical axis, using a globally defined direction to act as our 0. This will work wonderfully on your machine, where you test the valid and invalid positions you had in mind. But once you pass it on to quality assurance, the poor souls doing it will have this happen to them. You know, it seems like we should make sure that the player is actually behind the intended target for the backstab to make sense. So instead, you check where the player is relative to where their target is facing. You can represent how far around the target they are with an angle. You can require the angle to be larger than a set amount of degrees, such as 110. Or we can take the opposite of where the target is facing and check if the calculated angle is under 70. I call this the positional check. This makes it so the player actually has to be behind their target to get the backstab. But since it doesn't care what direction the player is looking in, we'll need the first check be made as well. We've only restricted things by where the subjects are facing and how far around each other they are, which means the backstab could be performed at any distance. So we add a raw distance check on top of this. So that's how you would do this, but as it turns out, they did it slightly different. You see, instead of checking if the backstabber is behind their target, they check if the target is in front of the backstabber. All those visuals look pretty convincing, didn't they? Now, as the reason why it's done this way, I don't know. Maybe they made riposte first and Backstab simply inherited it. Whether it checks if the target is in front of you versus if you are in front of the target obviously matters a lot less in the case of riposte, because the guy is standing still the whole time anyway. Of course, because of the existence of the angle check, it's hard to see the effective difference between the positional check as it is versus the way we thought it worked. But, as I'll explain later, it's one of the key factors that enables the crazy backstabs we saw earlier. Also, I'm sure you've been wondering, what's with all these things? I've modded in these visualizations in an attempt to show what I'm talking about more clearly. But as it turns out, From Software has their own visualization built in, which looks like this. But hang on, I thought you said the positional check looks at where the target is relative to the backstabber, not the other way around. The thing is, this isn't visualizing the positional check, it's visualizing the angle check. How do I know this? Well, it's because, yeah, I can stand outside what you would assume to be the backstab area and still initiate a backstab. You can also tell because it reads from the internal parameters for the angle check. So why is it visualized this way? If you log onto your opponent and stand anywhere within this area, you can get a backstab. This is because when you're anywhere within this 70-degree arc behind them, looking directly at the target will keep your facing angle within the acceptable 35-degree difference set for the angle check. Elden Ring's version of this visualization, in contrast to DS3's, even added what could be intended to serve as guidelines, showing you where you can direct your line of sight to get a backstab. But as long as you keep your facing angle the same, you don't need to be in the outlined area. Keep in mind, they obviously never intended us to see this visualization anyway, but this is why I made my own visualizations for this video, in an attempt to better represent what is going on. Speaking of, what would be a better version of this? The two visualizations I've made show each check individually, but it doesn't really visualize the area around the target in which backstabs are possible. You kind of just have to go in and try to align the checks. Luckily, with some math that hurt my head to figure out, I was able to calculate and visualize this area. In simple terms, it is possible to take a backstab if you are less than X degrees behind the target's back. X being the sum of the maximum angles allowed in both the angle check and the positional check. So in our case, that adds up to 105 degrees. However, due to player collision capsules, we are effectively blocked off from standing anywhere within a certain radius of the target player, leaving only this donut-like space to initiate backstabs from. Just being in those positions isn't enough though. Backstabs are indeed possible anywhere within this space, but it doesn't say anything about where your character needs to be facing. Using the ordinary angle check disc from earlier won't do us any good. Because remember, we need to satisfy both checks. To amend this, I've created an adjusted version of the angle check that shows you the range of orientations you can take given your current position. You'll see that the further from the target's back we go, this range gets increasingly narrow, approaching 0. The flashiest backstabs will often occur at these edges, because they don't even look right. The interesting implication here is that backstabs take more mechanical skill the quicker you try to take them. It takes time to move around the opponent, and while you can technically take a backstab after getting around just 75 degrees, in practice you're going to have to go a lot farther to make it reliable. But for the really flashy stuff, such as certain out-of-stun interactions, you may simply not have enough time to get the easier angles. The attack chain interrupts you before the backstab can go through. Depending on the attack sequence and the latency, it can be anywhere from impossible to extremely easy. What interests me most are the ones that are assumed to be impossible until they are proven otherwise. Oh. Yeah, my bad, I went a couple tangents too deep. We were talking about the angle check and positional check, which make up the attempt initiation step. If you press your light attack button while both those checks are passing, you get a backstab attempt that looks like this. People call this the whiff animation, but in truth, the animation always plays when you attempt a backstab. It just gets cancelled into the actual interactive backstab animation shortly into itself if the next steps pass. As it's more accurate, I'll be calling this the backstab attempt animation instead. The second step, which I call hit detection, is where the backstab attempting player casts a hitbox shortly into the attempt animation I just mentioned. This happens automatically, and succeeds if the hitbox collides with a valid target's hurtbox while it is active. If it doesn't hit a valid target, the animation will simply continue to play, ending with the slow whiff attack, which can still technically hit targets, but won't grab them. Unless it's the thrusting sword from Dark Souls 3. This step was first introduced in Dark Souls 2 in the form of a little jab with the hilt of your weapon. Dark Souls 3 brought it closer to the form it is in now, where it's literally invisible. The third step, which I call Defender Confirmation, is actually run on the targets game. Elden Ring is a peer-to-peer game with no lag compensation system, so this check will only run after the hit from the previous step travels over the network. It is very similar to step 1, utilizing both the angle and positional checks as well as the overall distance check. Except this time, it doesn't matter where each player appears on the Backstabber screen. It matters where the players appear on the target screen at the moment they receive that hit confirmation. Okay, but what the hell does that mean? Well, basically, everyone is in their own reality in this game's online. You're seeing everyone as they were a fraction of a second ago, and they're seeing you as you were a fraction of a second ago. This means the target of a backstab could have moved or turned a notable amount in the time it took for them to receive that their opponent has hit them, which means the third step will be run on a delay from the attacker's perspective. Even after it's run, it will take an equal amount of time for the backstabber to receive back the result of the check. Luckily, in most circumstances, the backstabber is stuck in place for this whole process, so we can actually see where each player was at the time of the check on both ends. Confused? Well, you should be. This aspect of the game is just so messed up and hard to wrap your head around. I'll eventually find a way to explain this adequately, but for now, just pretend like you get it. Okay, so let's talk about the background of this step. It was introduced in Dark Souls 3 specifically as a means to limit how attacker favored the first two steps are, especially on increasing levels of latency. By running this last check on the target's game, it ensures that things need to look right on the target's game as well, as the check runs when the grab attempt appears to hit them on their end. This is especially the case in Elden Ring, as in Dark Souls 3 they only check distance in this final check. But as you could imagine, even a little bit of latency could severely limit the circumstances in which all three steps could pass. As we know, it was exactly that way during the network test. To better understand why, I'm going to list out what the parameters were set to back then. During the closed network test, Backstabs had the following parameters. For backstab attempt initiation, the positional check required the backstabby to be less than 70 degrees around the backstabber. The angle check required the backstabber's angle to be within 35 degrees of the angle of the backstabby. And finally, the distance between the two players had to be less than 1.5. The numbers on the defender's side of confirmation were a bit different. The angle check was more permissive, allowing 60 degrees of difference, which makes sense because in the time it took to go from the initial checks to these defender-sided checks, the target has likely increased the difference by turning towards their backstabber. But the positional check was also set to only allow 60 degrees of difference, which makes it actually slightly less permissive than its attempt initiation counterpart. The player character, when locked on, can turn 60 degrees in 5 frames at 60 FPS. In the worst cases, the target of a backstab only needs to turn 25 degrees to negate it. It takes 14 frames for the grab box to come out after an attempt is initiated, so the target has loads of time to turn around. If the target has as little as 100 milliseconds of latency with you, they could appear to start turning around only after your grab box connects, and the backstab would have still been negated. With all that in mind, it makes sense that the only backstabs that tended to connect were ones done on ridiculously high recovery attacks. But even then, somehow they would still whiff. These were circumstances in which the target player had a lower profile. Intuition would suggest that the grab box was simply higher up and could miss them, or that there was a height comparison. There actually is a height comparison, but it seems to be based on the character's root position on the floor, so things like crouching wouldn't have any effect. And for the grab box thing, I've confirmed that just like today, the capsule shape is formed around 2 points in front of the character, one being on the ground and another being around at head height. Although maybe I have the wrong idea entirely. While editing this, I came across this old Ouroboros clip, which suggests it could be completely unrelated to elevation and be just due to some arbitrary factor. Anyway, I don't recall anybody ever complaining about this after the game's release, so they probably patched whatever was responsible at some point. Unfortunately, I didn't test it at the time, and I don't know of anybody else who may have. Let's move on to the changes we have an actual factual understanding of. But first, I'm going to briefly mention changes coming to this channel. In a few weeks or so, I'm going to be changing the channel name to Amirror. I've also made a second channel named Amirror, where I've been posting stuff that I couldn't find a place for in a bigger video. I've already uploaded some things there, and hopefully we'll be posting more. No promises though, not while I'm still recovering from my injuries. You can find a link for the channel in the description. The first confirmable changes came in patch 1.05, which was released June 13th, almost 4 months into the game. For the defender-sided confirmation, they doubled the numbers for the angle check and nearly doubled them for the positional check. Now, the angle check permits as much as 125 degrees of difference, and the positional check allows the target to be as much as 125 degrees around the initiator of the backstab. Consider how much less forgiving this is for the recipient player. A backstab could be confirmed because they were looking a little too much towards their opponent's side. They could even get backstabbed for simply trying to strafe their opponent. They also improved the distance check from 1.5 to 1.8, and for its equivalent on the attacker side of confirmation, they bumped it up to 1.7. For some reason, they only reference these changes as part of a bug fix, writing nothing but the line, "fixed a bug that prevented a critical hit from behind from hitting in hostile multiplayer." So apparently, according to this at least, backstabs weren't simply underperforming, they weren't even working as intended. I'm not sure exactly what the bug was. Maybe they just realized that the values they put were lower than they thought they put, maybe they weren't aware of how bad these values would work with latency, or maybe there was some actual bug somewhere else. All I know is the changes that we can see were very consequential. More than a year later, on July 27th, 2023, patch 1.10 came out. This time around, they actually listed some changes. They mentioned that the angles for critical attacks, which includes backstabs, had been improved. They had also mentioned that they buffed critical hit damage, improved the recovery of whiffed backstabs, and improved the poise damage of the whiff hit. Although, they left out arguably the most impactful change they made, which was the massive buff to the size of grab boxes. The capsule that is used for grab hit detection in the second step of backstabs used to have a radius of 0.5. In this patch, they buffed it to 0.7, which doesn't sound much bigger, but as you can see, it doesn't disappoint visually. Although in the case of Heavy Thrusting Sword, this one's a shower. Interestingly, they kept its grab box smaller than others while still giving it a buff. It's like they wanted us to know it is intentionally smaller. Or perhaps that its users are small. Also to note, with the release of the DLC, we got a bunch of new weapon classes that unsurprisingly had the old grab box size numbers, similar to how they initially had old poise damage numbers. The working theory is that the DLC's development started with an earlier game version, while the base game was being updated separately. When it was time to integrate all the DLC content into the latest version of the game, they pasted in all its new weapon and attack data without retroactively applying the changes the data would have been subject to in previous versions. To be clear, they still haven't fixed the DLC grab boxes as of 1.16.1. Anyway, 1.10's grab box change obviously buffed backstabs immensely in a number of ways. Many backstabs that would have previously died at step 2 are now able to go through. By increasing the hitbox's size, it both increases the effective range of backstabs and how good they are at catching lateral movement. It's likely that the change is responsible for how demonic roll catch backstabs are now. Like, seriously, if you try to use unlock rolls versus almost any good player, you are begging to get backstabbed. In regards to the angle check they mentioned, this refers to changes in both angle and positional checks for the defender side of confirmation, both of which had their numbers buffed up to 135 degrees. Here's the before and after. Remember the effective backstab area I showed you earlier? Here's how that looks now when it comes to the defender-sided check. The numbers on the check add up to more than 180, so they loop around and end up creating this Pokeball shape. So after initiation and hit detection, it's possible for a backstab to happen literally anywhere around the target. Although certain spots certainly have more forgiving facing angle ranges than others. Though this representation isn't all that useful for the defender-sided check, because at this stage, the target is the one with all the movement agency. Not that I care about it much, because it's not interesting mechanically, but the critical hit buff included a 5 to 12.5% buff to backstab damage for select weapon classes, seen here compiled by Krite in his patch 1.10 video. What is fairly interesting though is what they did for backstab whiffs. I haven't talked about them yet because they aren't as interesting as backstab confirmations, but they do matter a lot when it comes to the risk-reward of backstabs. Specifically the risk part. Because back in the day, when someone whiffed a backstab on you, you could literally watch a movie and come back and they would still be recovering. Ironically, punishing this whiff was probably the most common use of backstabs back then. To add insult to injury, not only was the recovery and attack startup very high, not only was the tracking non-existent, but the whiff hit quite literally did 0 poise damage. So you literally didn't even need to move a single inch out of the way like you would have had to otherwise. You could just start pressing buttons and cook up a concoction of a punish in their face. Regardless of all that, people would most often roll when they saw it due to the spooky factor of the backstab animation. Pro tip, when you see your opponent starting up the backstab animation, it's either too late to do anything and you're already locked into the animation, or it's failed and you have nothing to worry about. You can't react to backstabs themselves, so a good habit may be to go to your opponent's back for your own backstab whenever you see this animation, because there's literally no downside to it. If you are grabbed, your inputs will simply be ignored. Anyway, the recovery and poise damage improvements made whiffing slightly less life-ending. But all that still pales in comparison to the buffs affecting the ease of backstab initiation, hitting, and confirmation. For the first couple months of the game, backstabs were an active burden, or even a weapon your opponent could use against you. But now, there's a lot more finding out when it comes to fucking around that way. And that leaves us with today. To my knowledge, there hasn't been any changes when it comes to backstabs since patch 1.10, so we are officially up to date. Now, I can finally explain what I've been hyping up since the beginning of this video. How the hell is multi-tournament winner EU Festival of Combat 2023 champion top-tier player known as Dark Soapp able to hit these? Why do they go through when the guy is literally looking at him and hitting him? Soapp's out-of-stun scam stabs work by taking advantage of how tracking works over latency. Attack strings tend to track strongly during the startup of each move. Naturally, this tends to prevent backstabs as two locked-on opponents will be looking in opposite directions. Not in opposite directions of each other, but in an absolute sense. Remember, the angle check is about where the target is looking at, independent of the positions of each player. As a consequence of latency, the position of the player attempting the backstab will lag behind from where they actually are, and the orientation of the player doing the attack string will lag behind on the screen of the player doing the backstab. This allows for backstabs to be initiated in situations that they otherwise couldn't be. The defender confirmation step normally counteracts this, as the attack string will turn the player to face the backstabber before the point of final confirmation. But here's where the trick comes in. He doesn't initiate the backstab directly behind the opponent, he initiates it as far to the side as the positional check will allow, while still being sufficiently aligned with the opponent. This causes the target to look at him from his side, as he's still locked in looking in the same direction that the target was previously looking in. With how permissive the defender-sided angle check is at this point, simply looking at the player backstabbing you from the side is enough to let the backstab through. Personally, I don't think he was thinking of it this deeply, but this is how it works. And credit where credit's due, the guy makes pretty good videos, and is really good at the video game, so be sure to check him out. Just don't mind the thumbnails. Oh, and of course, credit to him for being such a big help on this video. He collected a bunch of footage for me that I probably couldn't have collected myself at the moment. Anyways, the logic behind these backstabs can be applied to virtually any kind of backstab, not just backstabs out of stun. For example, neutral backstabs. When going for one on a mobile opponent in Elden Ring, you generally want to initiate it just before your opponent makes a lateral movement around you or through you. When you initiate the stab, you'll be locked in place, and when they move around you, their facing angle is going to change to face you. Unless they are somehow still directly in front of you, lock-on will not face them in the correct direction to negate your backstab. As long as they don't move too far to be in this 70-degree circle sector behind you, they won't negate it by the positional check either. So yeah, it's been nice to see backstabs go through such a glow up. And maybe I just like how the clips look and the technical nonsense behind them, but I dare say that I like them more than Dark Souls 3's backstabs. I've said the word backstab way too many times recording this, so I'm gonna call here. Don't forget to check out the side channel, subscribe with notifications on if you enjoyed, and subscribe to my Patreon if you'd like to join the lovely people on screen. We're we're gonna get off this part of the video because it's starting to get a bit obtuse.
I don't want to be involved in this.